Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode on Space Tour Live. We're back again with the Space Roundup. Hey Nick and Terry, how are you guys doing?
All
Great.
good.
Awesome. Well, everyone, strap in for another great show. Grab your tea, grab your dinners if you have dinner this late, like me, um, and strap in for another great show. And make sure
Indeed.
to subscribe to the channel if you aren't already. Hey Chris, yeah, enjoy the show, guys.
Nice. We've already got lovely audience members in. How are you, Terry? How are you doing?
I'm doing well.
Good,
I've
good, good. All,
got the
all looking
honor first off.
indeed, indeed. So, as I said, we've got a packed show tonight. Strap in because it's going to be a ride. It's going to be quite interesting because we're covering a lot of ground and a lot of different topics. But this one, we were kind of hovering over the needle, as it were, 2 weeks ago on this one because it had just broken. But this is an amazing story, and Terry's going to lead on it. After you, Terry.
Yeah, I'm highly honored, not only first off, but I'm talking about meteorites, which is Nick's favorite topic. And he probably knows a lot more about it than I do, but it's an interesting angle. Right, let's start at the very beginning. One of the most basic questions in all of science, and indeed from the point of view of philosophy as well, is how did life start on planet Earth? It used to be that the favorite theory was that there was a sort of a primordial chemical soup of very basic chemicals, and that there were energy sources such as lightning strikes and heat from volcanic eruptions and all the rest of it. And somehow or other, that started chemical reactions, which developed into sort of primitive organic chemistry, and then life somehow developed from that. Then there's a theory that it came from comets, promoted mainly by Professor Chandra Wickramasinghe. Didn't say how life started in comets in the first place, but that it was brought to Earth on comets. And then there's another theory which is now gaining a lot more traction, and that is that it actually came to Earth, at least the primitive building blocks for life came to Earth on meteorites. And you might well say, well, actually, there's not a huge difference between some meteorites and some comets, which is probably true. There's some crossover ones, but for this particular talk, we're concentrating on what we think of as pretty normal meteorites, in other words, fragments of asteroids. So, what has happened is that in the past, some meteorites have been found to contain what are called sort of prebiotic chemicals. In other words, things that form the basis for life, although they're not actually a form of life in themselves. For example, the Murchison meteorite, which fell in Australia in 1969, was found to contain some nucleobases. In other words, the basic chemicals that go to form the basis of RNA and DNA. But that was only part of the story. So the latest development now is that astronomers and biologists and geologists in Japan have studied some new meteorites with not so much new meteorites, but using new techniques, which of course are becoming more and more advanced all the time. You now only need micrograms of a particular substance to be able to get a huge amount of information from it. So they have studied the Murchison meteorite again and some other ones, and they've now found basically all the prebiotic materials that you need to form the bases in RNA and DNA. Now, there are basically two types of nucleobases, the purines and the pyrimidines. And the purines had already been found in the Murchison meteorite and others, but not the pyrimidines. Now, through using the most advanced analytical techniques, they have discovered the three main components of the pyrimidines. And I was just checking that I'm getting this right because I'm not a chemist. The guanine and adenine. They're the purines which are already formed. They've now found cytosine and thymine, which are the other two bases that form DNA, and also uracil, which is formed in RNA, which is sort of an even more basic precursor to DNA. So that means that now in this selection of meteorites, they have found all of the components that make up RNA and DNA, and they basically are the building blocks of life. That's the famous double helix, which allows the reproduction of the information in cells and cell reproduction, which gives you multicellular organisms. So it's a very, very important step. It's indicating more and more that the chances that the building blocks for life came to Earth from space. And basically what we think is that the basic chemicals exist out there in comet nuclei and on asteroids, and that there's a chemical process which happens in space due to either energy from the sun or energy from cosmic rays or solar radiation and other wavelengths, which starts that basic chemistry developing on the meteorites and on the comets. And the evidence is that at least some of that can survive the impact of a meteorite or a comet nucleus on Earth, because these primitive chemicals have been found in the meteorites. Obviously, you need to be very careful that they haven't been contaminated after their fall on Earth, and they use all sorts of exploratory techniques and safety analysis to make sure that that doesn't happen. Of course, it does happen on the outside of the meteorite, but if you can look in the middle of it, that has not been contaminated. It's also a reason why it's very important to try and recover meteorites just as soon as possible after they're landed, so that any contamination from Earth-based life is kept to a minimum. So that's the latest development. All of the prebiotic chemicals, the primitive organic chemistry, which allows us to have RNA and DNA, have now been found in meteorites. And we'll be looking ever more closely now at the samples that are being brought back directly from asteroids such as Ryugu, which has already been recovered and has been studied by the Japanese, and Bennu, which is on its way back to Earth and hopefully will make a safe landing, and we'll be able to study that. But Nick, I know meteorites are your favorite topic, so over to you and let me know what you think about it.
What I love about this is the fact that these aren't like the Martian meteorites or some of the more esoteric meteorite types that a lot of the studies are being done on. This goes back to previous work that was done on a meteorite that I'm actually holding in my hand now. It's called Zag. So this fell in the Zag region in Morocco in 1998. I don't know if you can see that there clearly, but that's what's called fusion crust. So that's the the outer part of the asteroid or meteor. As it hits the upper atmosphere, starts to ablate, and basically you get this dark crust material, and then the meteorite can shatter in the upper atmosphere, fall as tens or hundreds of stones. Heavier pieces tend to go further down what's called the strewn field, and then you find all sorts of pieces. Now, Zag itself is only what's called an H5. It's an ordinary chondrite. It's nothing spectacular, not like, say, the Murchison meteorite, for example, which is more of an interesting type. You've got some of the amazing carbonaceous chondrites like Allende that's been studied since 1969. So this fall, late 90s fall, H5 chondrite, nothing spectacular. But then when it was analysed, there was organic matter again found in this. They found what they call these cold clasts. So it's almost like a rock within a rock. And within that, they found evidence of amino acids galore in this thing. It's an absolutely fascinating area, and you look at comets and you think, well, we know that there's lots of organics in comets, as Terry said before. The work from Chandra, Ramasinghe, etc. at Cardiff University. This is going back years and years in terms of the idea of panspermia and life being deposited on the Earth from an extraterrestrial source. And you had the red rain incident in India a few decades ago, etc. I love this, that meteorites, which are kind of always considered to be the kind of the boring part of the solar system relative to comets. The comets have got the organics, they've got the tails, they're spectacular as the meteorites. Asteroids not so much, but they're proving to be more and more instrumental, and not just the unusual asteroids, etc. As I said, it's the common, chondrites and the carbonaceous chondrites, not so common, obviously, which are delivering this really interesting set of results. This one, some of the class that were analysed, they think it was kind of outer solar system, really early outer solar system formation material that got kind of embedded in there. So there's probably going to be a lot more work done now on the likes of Zag and a few of the other meteorites. As Terry said, some of the pristine sample return missions that are coming back, they're going to be open season for this kind of work. So I love this story. It's just going to run and run and run. And as you said, this is one of the most fundamental questions for anyone on this planet: is where did we come from? Where did life come from? The whole science wants
wearing the carbonaceous chondrite
Absolutely, absolutely. But this is the thing, it's that, when I was growing up, and I guess when you were growing up, the whole idea of this kind of primordial soup being hit by lightning was always the big one, and that's what everybody thought. And it may still be the case.
Yeah.
We just don't know. We don't know what was out there before we were out there. Obviously, our solar system and associated, planets, our star, etc., you're going back 4.5 to 5 billion years, the coalescence of the sun, formation of the sun, turning into a nuclear reactor, as it were, it kind of starting to shine, blowing out the dust and the gases to the outer solar system. Then you had the whole migration of Jupiter, which is theorized in the early part of the solar system, and the disruption that caused to the planets. The possibility that life existed on Mars even before it existed here. We don't know. This is the whole beauty of science. We still don't know. Life on Earth could have been delivered from a meteorite impact on Mars that uplifted organic materials or the basis for life from Mars and then dumped that on Earth. We don't know. We know that things like tardigrades, for example, can survive for months, if not years on end, on the outside of the space station. So we just don't know. And that's the beauty of this. It's a fantastic story. And this is why we had to lead with it. I hope you agree, Terry. But yeah, it's just brilliant.
I mean, we're both fundamentally interested in space, but I think everybody has to be interested in how life started on Earth.
Yeah, and this is the thing. It shows that astrophysics, astronomy, etc., is so interlinked with all of the other sciences. When kids are studying for their GCSEs and their A levels, etc., and they're going, "Oh, I don't like chemistry, I don't like biology." All of these things are so interlinked with astronomy and astrophysics. This is astrobiology. This is astrochemistry. It's not just the single discipline of physics and how things move or how things explode or whatever. It's really, really interesting. So it's one of those things, if you've got kids in particular, this is how you get them interested in this kind of stuff. You put a meteorite in their hand and say, that's older than the planet you're stood on. Oh, and by the way, it could contain the basis for life. The basic building blocks of life could be in your hand as well, going back 4.5+ billion years. So yeah, it's amazing. One of those just really amazing stories. Anyway, moving a bit closer in some respects, obviously not as close as a meteorite hitting the Earth. Mars. So we've been talking about Ingenuity and this amazing little, just under 2 kilogram helicopter. It's about 40 odd centimeters high. So it's really, really tiny. The rotor blades on it, on the helicopter, and don't forget, these are having to spin at a terrific rate and lift the weight of the helicopter off the surface of Mars when you've got an atmosphere significantly less. We're talking about 100 times plus less than the density of the atmosphere on Earth, and it's got to lift off. So that's complex enough in its own right. But Mars has been plagued, and we've known this from the early part of the space age, even before the space age, when we were looking with telescopes, when features would disappear for entire seasons, as it were, and the astronomers at the time were looking through their telescopes and trying to work out what was happening. And it's these dust storms. You get planet-wide dust storms on Mars. There's known seasons when this happens, etc. Now, as Mars is approaching its Martian winter, as it were, the temperature is obviously dropping and the propensity for these dust storms is kind of on the increase. And what's happened is that Ingenuity, brave little helicopter, basically shut down for a couple of days. The interesting and I think funny thing with this is it shut down between May the 3rd and May the 5th. And I think it was just having a day off for Star Wars Day. This is May the 4th be with you and all that business. But essentially just before this, it had managed to image the back shell and the parachute from the Perseverance lander, which the images, literally, I had hairs on the back of my neck. It's goosebump stuff, and people saying, "Oh, it's littering the solar system." No, this is, as Stuart Atkinson, I think, said, it's kind of archaeology waiting to happen. It's a space tourist thing waiting to happen. We're going to visit these sites one day. We're going to visit the sites of Viking, and even going back to the early Soviet, the Mars 3 lander. We kind of know where it is now. We think we know where it is from the amazing images from HiRISE. Anyway, so Ingenuity shut down for about 2 days. This is principally because it didn't have enough power to charge its battery. So it's got 6 lithium-ion cells. Basically, they're using what's called COTS, common off-the-shelf parts. It's an amazing helicopter in terms of its design, but also the fact that it's nothing special in terms of the electronics and gubbins that are on it. It's common off-the-shelf technology that they've kind of thrown together. It was only designed to last for 30 Martian days or 30 sols. It's now over a year in. Don't forget, Perseverance landed last February with this thing strapped to its underbelly, dropped it down on the surface, rolled away. initial test, they didn't even know it was going to fly. 28 flights later, it's still going strong, and thankfully is still going strong. NASA thought they'd lost it for a couple of days. Then essentially what had happened is a lot of dust had built up on the rotors. So the rotor blades are also the solar panels. And if you think about the size of it, it doesn't have much of an area to do this recharging. So it recharges over a period of like days, etc. But obviously with the Martian winter coming, you've got less solar radiation hitting it and you've got more dust. So it is a problem. One solution, we were talking about this just before we went on air, would be possibly in a future mission, if you were going to do the same kind of thing where you've got a pairing of a helicopter, helo, and a rover, having almost like a gas compression capability on the rover that could absorb some of the Martian atmosphere and compress it and then act like a blower, so it could trundle over to the helicopter and blow the dust off if it got a bit too much. But yeah, it's they're having to survive this Martian winter. It's going to prove to be really difficult, and NASA don't know if Ingenuity is going to survive. Obviously, Perseverance, nuclear powered, totally different ball game. It's fine. It can switch its heaters on. It can maintain its stable temperature even during the depths of the Martian winter during shutdown. Effectively shut down. It can still carry on. Obviously, with Ingenuity, they can't do this. So they're looking at the best way to solve this problem. And what they've done is they've reprogrammed it. Again, beautiful technology. Reprogrammed it so the battery's kind of lowest point, as it were, before they go into a critical state has been lowered. So the heaters don't kick in and therefore sap the energy that it has got from the solar radiation and from the solar panels too soon. And I just love the fact that they've got around all these problems. Programmable FPGAs, field programmable gate arrays, that's the chip, the kind of brains of the helicopter, being able to reprogram that and reprogram all of the memory on board, and then re-establish this communication after they've re-established the communication after 2 days. Been able to do this. And then the beauty of Ingenuity is it's relaying kind of quite low data rates back to the rover, which is then relaying that back up to the deep space network from the surface of Mars. Again, that's an incredible feat in itself. I don't know what you think, Terry. I love this, that it's solving problems at these extreme distances with basically a bunch of parts that you could buy at Maplin if it still existed.
Yeah, they're brilliant at NASA, basically, in problem solving at a distance. I think it started basically with Apollo 13, whenever they had to rescue the spacecraft from a nearly crippling explosive disaster. Just on this point, there's both pros and cons of the Martian winter. If they do want it to fly again, and I presume they will at some stage, the colder air actually is denser. So that gives you slightly more lift from the rotor blades. Now, obviously, if you haven't got enough power to power the motor, you don't do it. But if they are going to be doing more flights, and I presume they will at some stage before the depths of the winter, the slightly colder air gives them that little bit more lift. So there's a little bit of a pro as well as the cons whenever the temperature is dropping and the angle of the sun and the amount of solar radiation is dropping as well. So it's not all doom and gloom. But as you said, it's absolutely amazing what they can do from a distance. They program in basically the ability to do upgrades and changes to the software because they know that things that can happen that you don't expect. You expect the unexpected in space missions. So well done to the guys and girls.
Yeah, and you say that it's not that long ago that spacecraft weren't designed to have this reprogrammable capability.
Yeah.
You're only looking, a few years ago where you've really had the whole ability to reconfigure a spacecraft to do a number of different jobs, specifically in low Earth orbit. Now that's really taken off, where you've got completely reprogrammable satellite capabilities. But as you said, I mean, it goes back to Voyager as well, being able to reprogram Voyager and spacecraft that have gone out when they had issues with telemetry on Galileo, etc., being able to reprogram and change the data rates and change the way that the transponders worked. It's amazing. And then again with Voyager, just okay, this is not working now, or this is going to draw too much power, let's shut this down, keep the critical instruments going to the point where we're going to have Voyager 1, Voyager 2 potentially running for at least another 4 or 5 years, which will be 50 years or 40, 50 years since launch. Using computational technology that was designed in the early 1970s. It's just, hat tipping. It's amazing. They really are just quite incredible. So when people moan about their computers going wrong at home, yeah, just try fixing something that's years old anyway at that distance. Anyway, moving on.
There's a question.
Go on.
Do you want to answer perseverance and ingenuity powered independently? Why keep them together? Well, as you say, they Ingenuity needs to send at a very low data rate back to Perseverance, and then it can send at a higher rate back to Earth. But yeah, they're separate, but they can't get too far apart.
Yeah, and the other question about could Ingenuity hibernate? The issue is the temperature. The temperature drops so much that you're causing potential damage. You've got to keep the electronics above a certain temperature. So they've got to have heating systems that can look like with Voyager with the RTGs. They've got to maintain a core temperature in the system. If it goes below a certain point, then effectively the spacecraft will die and it won't be able to recover, even with solid state electronics. Obviously, again, it's a good point though that you've raised about the distance between them, because what you could have again is almost like a jump start boost, as it were, from the main rover. So if they're not too far apart, being able to trundle the rover over to Ingenuity and having almost like a small docking port, as it were. You'd think of R2D2, for example, in the Star Wars movies, where you kind of had that little probe that you don't want to have USB cables or anything like that, but something simple that you can almost jump start it. Again, would be an interesting idea for future missions if this kind of power issue is going to be a problem. We're going to be talking about something else interesting later in the show with respect to nuclear power, which could be a complete game changer anyway. But yeah, it's interesting. Thanks, Ground-Based Space. Great questions, and Chris, etc. Really keep the questions coming. So we love these kind of questions. But it's an interesting one, and keeping them relatively close together when you've got low data rates and low transmission kind of distance capability from the rover to the main helicopter as well. Yeah, you've got to keep them relatively close together. Anyway, much closer. Oh, go on, sorry, Ted.
Right, so I was just going to say, we forget just how cold it can get on Mars as an extreme. In the middle of the night, in the middle of the Martian winter, don't quote me on this, but I think it goes down to below -80 in centigrade.
Yes.
It's of that order anyway, and things just don't work at that temperature. And in fact, they can, as you say, just fail totally, so that they can't be restarted. So you do need to keep a minimum degree of temperature for electronic components.
Yeah, essentially in the Mark Watney solution, obviously, if you watch The Martian, where he digs up the RTG and uses a heater for his little trundling rover, as it were, not really optimal. But again, we'll talk about this in a bit, the whole nuclear power in space thing. Right, moving closer. We've got two cracking stories here that Terry's going to go on what's happening with not only the US space station, but our Chinese friends. Terry.
Yeah. Indeed. We've heard a lot over the last couple of weeks from our friend Dmitry Rogozin, head of the Roscosmos, who has been sort of nearly Trumpian in his Twitter blasts about what's happening. I do feel sorry for the guy. I don't know how much of a genuine supporter of Putin he is. Maybe he feels he has to, but he is really being crippled by the sanctions being applied by the West to basically the whole of the Russian Space and Technology Center because of the invasion of Ukraine. So the whole lot of things, we don't have time to go into them all, but basically they're being very badly affected. And he's not a happy buddy, to put it mildly. So he's been threatening all sorts of things to totally abandon the ISS and then let it crash down. He was almost sort of hinting that he would hope that it would crash on America or in Europe or whatever. And of course, there is a very valid point at the moment. We need the Russian spacecraft to boost the ISS up to a higher orbit periodically. It does sink gradually back down closer to the Earth because of friction with the very thin but nevertheless not negligible upper Earth's atmosphere. And as solar activity increases, as we build up in the current solar cycle, that's going to become more and more necessary. So basically they use the excess fuel and power in the Russian docking spacecraft, primarily the cargo craft, to boost the ISS up a few tens of kilometers every so often, to stop it basically spiraling down and crashing into the Earth. Excuse me, but what he has now said is that they have, they have actually taken a formal decision that they will withdraw from the ISS. It's just a matter of when. and I'll come on to the other aspect of that later on. But he says that at the moment they will continue to maintain their commitment up to at least the end of 2024, and under the contract by which the main contributors to the ISS, America, ESA, Russia, and Japan, and Canada, they all have to give a minimum of 1 year's notice before they actually withdraw their contribution and their commitment to it. So he has said that Russia will give a minimum of 1 year's notice. So that leaves the ISS with a problem. Not only are the Russians the main suppliers of fuel and cargo, but they also bring up not at the moment most, but certainly recently, they were bringing up all of the astronauts to the ISS. Now we have Elon Musk and SpaceX doing the same sort of thing. Other players will come along. But at the moment, there's no actual practical technology to raise the orbit of the ISS on a regular basis. So heads are going to have to be put together and thinking caps on to see how that can be done. Now, there are other spacecraft, as I said, mentioned the ISS, servicing the ISS, particularly SpaceX, and it shouldn't be beyond the bounds of human ingenuity to get them to also be able to raise the orbit of the ISS as needed. But it is something that needs to be addressed after 2024, which will be just about the maximum, coming up to the maximum of the next solar cycle, whenever the Earth's atmosphere gets most distended. Basically, the extra blast of radiation from the sun heats the Earth's upper atmosphere and makes it expand, and that increases the drag on the space station so that it would gradually spiral down and crash to Earth if the orbit wasn't raised periodically. So in terms of crew, if the Russians withdraw completely, then there'll be no more Russian cosmonauts going up. ESA and the other countries will still be able to send up anybody that's eligible to fly by SpaceX and by, whoever comes along and can satisfy NASA that they can do it safely. So that now appears to be a formal decision that after 2024, Russia will completely withdraw from the ISS, which is a real shame because there's nobody to blame but Putin for that happening. The cosmonauts and the astronauts on board get on apparently well together. They get on with the science. There's no rows. And I presume they simply don't discuss politics or the situation in Ukraine at all, except maybe amongst themselves, out of earshot of the others. So the science goes on. But because of the sanctions, Russia really is basically unable to continue its contribution to the ISS. And that leads on to the second part of the story.
Can I jump in a little bit?
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
No, it's interesting, just before we move on to the next one. You've hit the nail on the head in that the collaboration between the astronauts and the cosmonauts on board is really, really good, and they are consummate professionals. And you'd imagine Dmitry Rogozin, pre all of this happening, was quite a highly respected member of the space community. And obviously, his work on Soyuz and his work with Roscosmos, he'd done a good job. And he could have chosen to stay silent. He could have chosen to kind of not become embroiled in all of the political machinations of what's happening, and maintained almost like a dignified silence. If he didn't want to go against his boss, as it were, then he could have said, okay, we've got agreements. Obviously, with the sanctions will hurt them. The sanctions will cost them. But again, the way that he's been behaving and carrying on, and you say about threats to deorbit the ISS, he's making personal threats against people like Elon Musk. Elon Musk tweeted this week, if I'm found dead in an alley, don't be surprised, kind of thing, or words to that effect. And we all know, and it's a horrible thing to remind ourselves about, especially I live quite near Salisbury in the UK, which was a subject to a Russian chemical weapons attack not so long ago. And we were talking before we went on air about, poisoned umbrella tips, etc. These kind of things, it sounds really scary and sad, but it has happened. And don't forget, with the ISS as well, we've got an aging space station. We've got an aging space station that's already developing leaks. It already has issues, in some of the modules. If Russia decide to pull out and potentially disable some of their modules. It may not be just a case of getting the CST Starliner from Boeing or SpaceX, or Dream Chaser, somebody said in the comments as well, getting something like that up there to do an orbital reboost. We're talking about potentially life-threatening scenarios here, and would the US and the Europeans want to remain on the space station? Don't forget, the Russians also performed an ASAT test, an anti-satellite weapons test, where the debris field from that is intersecting the orbit of the ISS. Now, if Russia don't have anyone aboard the ISS, it's not so much of a threat to them. In terms of, you've got to think long term, and it sounds like crazy, almost like Tom Cruise type conspiracy theory stuff, but you only have to see what's going on with hypersonic missile attacks and threat of chemical and nuclear weapons to see that no holds barred here. They could basically do anything, and if they were to pull out the ISS and just leave US and Japanese and European astronauts on board, are they going to be as bothered if there's potential debris issue where without that orbital maneuvering capability, who knows what could happen? It's a horrible thought. It's a really, really horrible thought. So there's a lot of spin-off and political implications for this as well.
Yeah, it's a valid point. As you say, he could just have sort of maintained a restrained silence, but he didn't. And as you say, even personal threats against Musk, who is not even a politician or an official NASA person, he's just a citizen, basically. He's not in any way involved, although he has been supplying a lot of stuff to Ukraine in terms of Starlink and so on. But anyway, there's a point coming up which actually sort of will almost counter what I was saying earlier. And that is the next part of the story is that they have said that instead they're going to join with China in cooperation with them on the Chinese space station, which is already up there. We'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. But they're hoping to build some modules to go on the Chinese space station. So the point I was saying about the sanctions hurting them, it's not going to hurt them so much, apparently, that they won't be able to build these modules, or at least that's what they're claiming. So they want to put, at the moment, they're saying at least 2 modules on the Chinese space station, if China agrees. And they already have a sort of an agreement in principle for this sort of thing. So the latest point now is that China is going to develop the Tiangong space station, possibly eventually to something approaching the size of the ISS, although we don't know that for certain. There are 6 flights coming up before the end of the year. The first one is a new crew, the Shenzhou 14 crew, which will be going up in June. Then they're going to add the first of 2 more modules, the Wenchang, and I'm not going to try and apologize for my pronunciation or what it actually means in Chinese, but a second module is going up in July. Then another module, the third and final module of the current plans, will be going up in October. And then there'll be another crew, the 15 crew, Tiangong 5 cargo launch in sometime in September probably, and then in October, certainly before the end of the year, the Shenzhou 15 crew, the next crew of 3, will be going up. So that's 6 more launches to the Chinese space station before the end of this year. So they're really going full steam ahead. As we were saying earlier, Russia will maintain its commitment on the ISS at least to the end of 2024, but they'll probably already be planning and talking to China about what they can do in cooperation with China in the future. So if they're going to be building new modules to go on the Chinese space station, then they're presumably going to get the component parts. If they're not available in Russia itself, they'll be able to get them from China. As we know, and this is a completely different topic, China is very good at stealing technology and expertise from other countries. So if they can't get their vital components from Russia, they're going to get Chinese clones, which will possibly work almost as well. So I'm sure you have thoughts on that aspect as well, Nick.
Yeah, it's just really sad that, again, there's this kind of barrier in the scientific community between cooperation with China, for example. The US obviously won't allow pretty much any Chinese cooperation from a defense military perspective, obviously, but even from a space perspective, it's kind of sad, apart from the radio telescope, where European and multinational scientists are allowed access to some of the radio telescope technology. It's interesting as well. China have already lodged complaints about some of the orbital debris issues. So as China's space station gets
But
bigger,
they've created their own too.
exactly.
Yeah.
And the US and Canada this week have signed an agreement that there's going to be no more ASAT tests, because let's not just put all the blame on rogue nations, as it were. We've got, the US were one of the first to start with this ASAT test business. So it's not just the Russians, the Chinese, etc., that that have caused the mess up there. And then I was reading this week about the ITU, the International Telecommunications kind of body, as it were, who can't cope with the number of filings that are coming through for satellites and the amount of spectrum that's being used. And, there's quotes from Rwanda. Rwanda currently have one satellite, which is a CubeSat in orbit, and they're looking at, I think it's several 100,000 satellites in some kind of constellation. But the reality is the constellations are growing and the debris threat is growing. And all of this, it kind of links into our last story. Is going to become more and more of an issue for these large space stations, especially if you're looking about large space stations with continual human habitation on them. So interesting where China are going with this. If they're going to go for something, obviously it's not going to be as big as the ISS, but it's still going to be a large structure. And reliance on Russia, for all the goodwill in the world, the Russians are going to be suppressed by some of the sanctions. They're not going to have access to some of the technologies. They're probably going to cut a few corners in terms of quality control, etc., because they're going to have to. If the budgets are gone, then one of the first things that normally goes when your budget goes is some of your testing. I mean, it's sad to say, but it does happen. So let's see where they go. Some comments in the chat here. Yeah, US owning the Zarya module. Yeah, Rogozin is a politician. Absolutely, he's not a space person. Yes, I do remember the trampoline tweet, Chris. It's just really sad that it's come to this. Talking to friends, I've got a friend who's one of the ground controllers for the ISS, and she was saying, there's agreements in place. This is a few months ago, and the ISS is protected, the ISS is safe, and now we know it isn't. And the longer this horrible conflict goes on in Europe, the more impact we're going to see across a whole range of domains. And the defense domain is a really important one here. And I alluded to it with the ISS conversation. If the Russians do pull out of the ISS, there's nothing stopping Russia from militarizing space in a much bigger way. So let's just see what happens there. Anyway, there may be a solution to this, and that leads us on to our last story. So this is DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. This is kind of the top secret defense research group in America, who are now looking at plans for nuclear-powered spacecraft. Now, this isn't new. Nuclear-powered spacecraft has been an idea since Terry was little. Freeman Dyson, you remember Freeman Dyson, Terry?
I do.
Project Orion. So everyone thinks Orion, the spacecraft, that's Lockheed Martin's crew module for the Space Launch System. No, Orion was a spacecraft designed in the 1960s, which was going to have nuclear propulsion. The way that they were going to nuclear propel this thing was they had a gigantic metal backplate on it, and they were going to fire out basically small bombs out the back of it, small nuclear bombs, detonate them behind the spacecraft. And the energy from that explosion was going to accelerate and propel the spacecraft, potentially up to 1/10 the speed of light, was one of the research studies. And they did some ground testing on this, obviously not with nuclear weapons, but with chemical weapons to demonstrate, and some videos on YouTube exist of this, the booster going up into it, launching from the ground. What this is now, this DARPA, it's called the Draco, which is the, I've got to remember the acronym, Dynamic Rocket Agile.
I have it written down because I can
Agile
remember it.
Cislunar Operations.
Demonstration rocket for agile cislunar operations.
That's the one. Yeah. Essentially, so cislunar is Earth to the Moon, obviously, and what they're looking at is a highly maneuverable rocket that can do very fast transfers and very high maneuverability between the Earth and Moon. If you wanted to do, orbital changes, or if you wanted to do, a docking maneuver, etc. This kind of power in the spacecraft, where essentially you've got a combination of a traditional, almost like a traditional chemical propulsion system where you've got your hydrogen tanks, but in the middle of this, you've got a nuclear reactor. You've got a nuclear generator that basically is heating up the gases as they're kind of propelled through, as they're pumped through, and then pushing them out the exhaust. And that's one way of doing it. The problem with that is it can be extremely difficult to test on the ground. And there's a big heated debate on this on various threads going on about how much nuclear waste, as it were, is going to come out the back end, because you've got a self-contained nuclear reactor which is heating it, and theoretically, therefore, you shouldn't get much in the way of nuclear material coming out the back. But there's all sorts of debates. So this is a phase 2 study. Phase 1 was a de-risk that they've already kind of completed. So they've now looked to Blue Origin, and Blue Origin obviously doing great guns with their suborbital flights with New Shepard, moving on to New Glenn and New Armstrong, and obviously they're back in the race now in terms of the lunar lander, now that NASA have opened up the contracts again. So they've opened up to Blue Origin and Lockheed Martin. Now, Lockheed Martin, this is where DARPA come in. So Lockheed Martin are one of the biggest defense contractors on the planet, if not the biggest defense contractor on the planet. And they're looking at it not only from a maneuverability and cislunar space perspective, but obviously the ability to move at a very rapid rate. And this is where it comes in with ion thrusters, for example, which we've seen used in some deep space missions to great effect. Their thrust capability and their acceleration capability is quite limited. They can get up to speed, but it takes them time. Chemical, it's not as efficient, and you've got to be carrying a lot of fuel. With the nuclear thrust capability, you don't have to carry as much fuel, so your mass to kind of thrust ratio increases enormously. And the ability to move something in orbit from a defense perspective is really, really interesting, especially if you've got collision avoidance maneuvers, etc., or you're just wanting to get away from something like Russia's Luch satellite, which is quite capable of hovering and getting quite close to NATO assets and satellites, or even non-NATO assets and satellites, and having a kind of sniff around of what they're doing. So it's really, really interesting. They're looking for a flight demo on this around about 2026. Flights to the moon obviously are going to be commencing by then. We're looking at the Lunar Gateway, hopefully well underway by then. We're looking at potentially some of the first lunar missions. Hopefully we'll have seen the first launch of SLS and the orbital kind of Apollo 8 style non-crewed mission in the next hopefully 2 to 3 years, followed by a crewed mission where they're going to orbit, followed by a landed mission. So potentially 2026 to 2028, the timing could work quite well from a perspective with this. And yeah, there are other alternatives. As I said, it is difficult to ground test. There's what's called a magnetoplasma dynamic thruster as well, which utilizes, a combination of the Lorentz force, and basically it can utilize multiple input sources. So you could have a nuclear generator combined with a whole range of different input sources, which is another potential for either deep space long duration missions or this kind of thrust capability. I love this because if it does kind of take off, pardon the pun, and fly, it's going to open up the ability to do really deep space missions with, potentially huge amounts of thrust capability, therefore reducing the time on these missions. The last show we talked about planned missions to Uranus and to Saturn's moon Enceladus, etc. So there's a lot of potential here, not just in the defense domain. And I'm hoping, with it being the likes of Lockheed and Blue Origin obviously aren't really in the defense game so much as more commercial space. Lockheed have got their kind of feet in both buckets. It's going to be really interesting to see how this one develops. I don't know what your thoughts are on this, Terry, but
yeah, I totally agree. There's one other angle as well as being able to move her towards or away from a target, and that is in the case of an emergency.
Yep.
You can get back to Earth a lot quicker. But you mentioned Lunar Gateway there, which reminds me of another thing that Russia is also planning to work with China on a lunar base. Both an orbiter and a ground station, which will be one step ahead of NASA at the moment, because Lunar Gateway is just to be an orbiter. So that's another area where they're going to be, or planning to be anyway, in cooperation with China on that. Although I think it's 2035 they're talking about for the base on the moon. From the Chinese, and perhaps, as I said, a joint Chinese-Russian mission. So it's all happening, basically. And the one thing about nuclear power, there was a time during the 70s, 80s, 90s, I suppose, mainly, when people were so worried about the possibility of a rocket with nuclear fuel on board, nuclear reactive material crashing, before it gets into orbit, that it was politically unacceptable, basically, to put a nuclear-powered engine on board the spacecraft. I think now that the safety angle has improved considerably and rockets are becoming a lot more reliable, there's a little less apprehension about that. And basically, I suppose if a private operator wants to do it, or one of the countries who's not too worried about the sort of international conventions in space, if they want to do it, nobody can actually stop them. But as you say, that's really the only sensible way or practical way to get a reasonably large payload out to the outer parts of the solar system fairly quickly.
What's also interesting, you talked about that, and I remember Galileo, it was the Galileo spacecraft, and Cassini in particular as well, where there were protesters at the fence at the launch site, basically trying to stop it launching. And you think about, RTGs have been used since the Apollo era. There were RTGs, the Snap 27 RTG, radiothermonuclear generator on, Apollo 12. I've worn the type in that Pete Conrad was on, wearing on the lunar surface. Apollo 13 had one as well. That's the only bit that's probably survived, the Apollo 13 crashing into the Pacific. Somewhere at the bottom of the Tonga Trench is a part of Apollo 13 that's probably still kicking out nuclear radiation. The RTGs, they've got a half-life in like the hundreds or thousands of years. So there's something down at the bottom of the Pacific in the Tonga Trench that, belongs to Apollo 13, as it were. So yes, there is a risk. Obviously, there's a risk. But the whole thing with nuclear power is that you've not just got the nuclear propulsion systems, but you've got, if we, looking at serious return to the lunar surface, in particular, yes, certain parts of the lunar surface we can tap into almost perpetual sunlight, but there will be parts of the lunar surface, bottom of craters, etc., where they're going to potentially need alternate energy sources. If you go mining, if you go subsurface, you're going to need potentially alternate energy sources. If you go out into deep space and you're looking at landers, you look at Huygens, for example, on Titan, the battery power on that only lasted a few hours. If they'd have had a nuclear power source, that thing could have survived for months doing really good science. If they're looking at putting a submarine, for example, the Kraken submarine onto the methane lakes on Titan, you're going to be looking at nuclear powered sources. And obviously with the Mars rovers, that's now an adopted kind of standard, as it were, rather than solar power on Spirit and Opportunity. It's more commonplace, but it's one of those things, and especially with energy on Earth now, and there's a whole huge debate about the use of renewables versus nuclear, and etc. But as you said, Terry, it's got a lot safer. There will be an accident. There's undoubtedly going to be an accident. Spacecraft, it's a dangerous game. Who knows what's going to happen? But my concern with this is that if America are working on it, I'm sure that, as you said, China are very good at copying anything. So China will be working on it, Russia will be working on it. And again, it comes down to quality control. And if, the safety mechanisms are in place, if you've got an orbital launch trajectory that takes you, from China, for example, over the Pacific, and then you don't do orbital insertion. We've had Skylab and other things. We've had, spacecraft land and dump nuclear material over Canada. We've had Skylab crash all over Australia. Things happen. So we shall see. Going to the chat, ground-based space, yes, Saxaford. So had a keen interest in a lot of these launch sites. So Scottish Space, just a kind of quick aside because it's coming from the chat. Yeah, Astra have announced that they're going to launch from Saxaford. There's a lot of good things happening up in Scotland at the moment. The economic implications of what's happening, and obviously with Skyrora being one of the big players up there and their main manufacturing base being in Dnipro in the Ukraine, there's a whole ton of issues still to get through. We've got Virgin Orbit really ramping up now towards a launch from Cornwall, Spaceport Cornwall. You've got a number of companies aiming to launch from Scotland. You've got both vertical and horizontal takeoff proposals for Scotland. You've got one site in Wales as well. So UK space, hopefully is going to really, pardon the pun again, take off in the next 12 months. But again, with the economic crisis, it's an interesting one that Ground Space Space has raised there. I was a big kind of proponent of this and was getting quite involved, and we were developing a Pico satellite, and we were looking at we were talking to all these launch providers about all sorts of integration methods and what we could do to support them because of what my company does in terms of range trajectory, safety, etc., for the defense sector. Now with the current economic crisis, they've got to play very carefully with the public, because the public backlash against what is still perceived to be a rich man's playground with space rockets and space launch, etc., you're going to have to really sell the economic benefits to the UK economy for this, and UK science in particular. And polar orbital CubeSats that are doing environmental monitoring is great, but the average person in the street by October, November this year is barely going to be able to afford to heat their house. So it's a really interesting problem. And I think thanks to Ground-Based Space for mentioning that. Watch this space, as it were. But it's something we're going to cover a lot more in future as it gets closer. I was hoping by the Jubilee somebody was going to launch, but maybe not happening. On to our final bit, which is our lookup section. And there's a cracking event happening very soon, isn't there, Terry?
Yep, indeed. Sunday night, Monday morning, basically Monday morning. But if you say Monday, an awful lot of people will think, oh, well, look out on Monday night. This is the early hours of Monday morning, the 15th to the 16th of this month. And you'll hear a lot and read a lot of hype, I'm sure, in the media over the coming days leading up to it about a blood moon and a blood red moon and all sorts of media exaggeration. But we are, in fact, going to get one of the relatively spectacular and not too rare events in the sky, a total lunar eclipse, when the moon passes totally into the shadow of the Earth in space. It doesn't happen every month because, of course, the orbit of the moon is tilted at an angle of 5 and a bit degrees to our ecliptic path of the Earth around the sun. So most of the time at new moon, the moon is actually passing above or below the Earth's shadow in space. Every so often it passes into it, perhaps partially when you get a partial eclipse, or totally into the shadow when we get a total eclipse. Now, there's good news and bad news. This will be visible if the skies are clear over the whole of the UK, but it will be as the moon is setting. And for once, those of us in Ireland will actually get a better view than the rest of you in the UK. The rest of the UK, because the further west you are, the better the view you will get, because the moon will be still relatively high above the horizon when it goes into the total part of the eclipse. Now, you can find all this on social media, but just to give you an idea what we're talking about, the moon will pass into the penumbra, which is the very faint outer part of the Earth's shadow, at 0230, and these are summertime times, not universal time, 0230, and you will barely notice that unless you're very keen-eyed and very used to looking at the moon. The outer shadow of the Earth, the partial shadow of the Earth, is very, very faint. It will start to pass into the umbra, which is the main part of the Earth's shadow, at 0327, and that's when you'll first start to see a darkening along the side of the moon that is entering the shadow. The totality, when the whole of the moon has passed into the Earth's shadow, starts at 0428, and you'll already know at this time of the year that's when it's starting to get very near dawn. So the moon will be low down in the southwest for all of the UK and Ireland, but the further west and the further south you are, the higher the moon will be as it enters into the total part of the eclipse. Now, the middle of the eclipse is at 0511. And the moon will be really low down. In fact, for people in northeast Scotland and East Anglia, the moon will be just about setting then. I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. Now, the moon, although it's passing completely into the Earth's shadow, which is between 2.5 and 3 times the diameter of the moon, because the Earth's a lot bigger than the moon, obviously, it won't pass through the center of the shadow. It will pass to the south of the center of the Earth's shadow. So the north edge of the moon will appear slightly darker. It will be closer to the center of the shadow than the south edge. And that should be just about noticeable. So, as I said at the beginning, there'll be a lot of hype about a blood red moon and all the rest of it. The moon does turn red during a total eclipse because the red light from the sunlight, basically the Earth's atmosphere acts like a sort of a spectrum dispersal, like a prism to a certain extent, and the blue light gets scattered more, and the red light gets more focused onto the moon. So it's mainly the red part of the solar spectrum that gets onto the moon, the surface of the moon, during a total eclipse. That's the part that is refracted onto the surface, and it does turn red. It can turn a deep crimson red or a light orange or anything in between, depending on various conditions in the Earth's atmosphere, the amount of pollution, the amount of aerosols high up in the atmosphere, and you don't really know in advance. Now, one of the things about this eclipse, since it's happening near sunset, the moon, full moon, by definition, is diametrically opposite the sun in the sky. And if it's in an eclipse, it's absolutely opposite to the sun in the sky. And that means as the moon is getting lower down and deeper into the eclipse, the sun is also just about to rise on the other side of the horizon. And the effect of that is that the sky will be brightening in twilight. So you've got two effects, both of which are contributing to make the end of the eclipse that bit harder to see. The moon will be getting darker, but the sky will be getting brighter as the sun comes up. And obviously, at the moment of sunrise, that is when the moon will be setting. So to get the best view, basically, you want to be as far west and as far south. In mainland GB, the folks down in southwest Cornwall or the Scilly Isles will get the best view of all. In the whole of the UK and Ireland, the southwest of Ireland will get the best view. But everybody in the UK, if the sky is clear, will be able to see the part where the moon has entered totally into the Earth's shadow. Now, as I say, it's a moderately rare event. There are total eclipses of the moon every year or two, but we won't see another total eclipse where the whole of the total eclipse is visible in the UK until the year 2028, and we won't see one where the whole of the eclipse from entry into the penumbra to exit from the penumbra again until December 2029. So this one is your best chance for quite a few years to see a total lunar eclipse, and you will need clear skies. There's a couple of other things. You'll get an even better view if you have a pair of binoculars, and that will show up a beautiful star field in the background. Normally, you don't see the stars terribly well when the moon is full, but when it gets dark during a total eclipse, you can see the surrounding stars. It will lie in a star field which has a number of reasonably bright coloured stars. So if you have binoculars, have a look with binoculars and get a good view. Telescope will give you even better view as long as it's reasonably wide field. So that's the treat coming up Sunday night, but really basically in the early hours of Monday morning leading up to the dawn twilight. So I wish everybody clear skies for that.
It's also a great way to prove that the Earth isn't flat.
Yeah.
It's interesting as well because as the moon is setting, obviously you've got atmospheric absorption, you've got atmospheric effects happening anyway. So you've got that reddening of the moon as it's going towards the horizon. So it's going to be a tricky one, this, and especially the timings on it. You said west of Ireland, you're probably laughing. East coast of America could be quite nice as well, potentially. But at this time of year, it's not optimal. You've got, these multiple effects, as you said, moon setting. I'm going to try and have a look for it. I've seen some of the comments in the chat, Ground-Based Space in particular. Yeah, if you're walking to work at 4:15, good on you. It's going to be a tough one to see. But if anyone is listening and they want to send in pictures or, tweet either myself or Terry via Twitter, send us some pictures. We'd love to see anything like that. It'd be fantastic. We've just come out of the Lyrid meteor shower for 2022 in the last week or so. I've seen some great pictures of that, and obviously some of the satellite mess up there as well that people have been taking with their meteor cameras. But yeah, if you want to send in pictures,
I was just going to say, you can get quite good pictures now just on a smartphone on its own if it's got a zoom function, and also you can get very good quick pictures with a smartphone just holding it up to the eyepiece of a telescope or even a pair of binoculars if they're mounted on a tripod. So by all means, have a go and you might get some beautiful photos.
Absolutely. So we'll say sayonara for now. Hand you back to our fantastic host at Space Store. Check out Space Store. Terry and I were talking about he's going to try and come over to Harwell, and I'm so excited if you come over because my company's got a little kind of Coast Space Office up at Harwell, so which is the big space cluster centre in Oxfordshire. It does so much amazing work. It's where we first got in touch with Space Store and met up with them. Great bunch of guys, and they've got their little office and their fantastic shop just outside in Didcot. But I'll hand you back to them and let them say their goodbyes.
Yep.
Yeah, well, thank you once again, Nick and Terry, for another great show. It's been great to see everyone talking in the chat. Thanks, Ground-Based Space, as ever. Chris, thanks for joining us again. Yeah, if you haven't checked out the Space Store website, go ahead, spacestore.co. Check out the different experiences, events we have. We have a small shop in Didcot. And I'm not sure if I'm allowed to say this, but there is potentially some big news coming with regards to some new space stores opening.
I know. I know what's happening.
Opening. I think my manager will permit me to say that much. As watch out. Make sure you're subscribed to our mailing list if you aren't already, because we'll be sure to let everyone through our regular newsletter over there. But there's definitely some new exciting news coming. So watch this space. Subscribe to the channel if you aren't already. And Nick and Terry will be back in a couple of weeks' time with another roundup. Until then, stay safe.
If Terry comes over, we could do a live broadcast from Space Store.
Kind of,
we could do it seated next to each other.
Yeah,
that'd be great. We've got our own studio. We've got our own studio in Harwell, so it would make sense to potentially do one in person for once.
That would be very cool. All right.
Okay, cheers and clear skies for Sunday night, Monday morning.
Yeah.
Right, again. Anything else?
That's all good.
Okay. Bye, everybody.
See you guys later.
Cheers all. Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Hi, my name's Nick Howes, space enthusiast, author, writer, broadcaster.
Hi, I'm Terry Moseley, past president of the Irish Astronomical Association, lifelong astronomy and space nerd, absolutely fascinated by everything, both man-made and natural up there.
So every 2 weeks, Terry and I give you the latest, hottest news from space and human spaceflight, robotic spaceflight, and what's happening up in the skies. Please tune in to us every fortnight with the Space Store. Adios, amigos.
Bye, all.